The Jallianwala Bagh massacre, also known as the Amritsar massacre, took place on the 13th of April 1919. Acting Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered troops of the British Indian Army to fire their rifles into a crowd of unarmed Indian civilians in Jallianwala Bagh, Amritsar, Punjab, killing at least 379 people and injuring over 1,200 other people. On Sunday the 13th of April 1919, Dyer, convinced a major insurrection could take place, banned all meetings. This notice was not widely disseminated, and many villagers gathered in the bog to celebrate the important Hindu and Sikh festival of Baisakhi, and peacefully protest the arrest and deportation of two national leaders, Satyapal and Saifuddin Kichlu. Dyer and his troops entered the garden, blocking the main entrance behind them, took up position on a raised bank, and with no warning opened fire on the crowd for about 10 minutes, directing their bullets largely towards the few open gates through which people were trying to flee, until the ammunition supply was almost exhausted. The following day Dyer stated in a report that, "I have heard that between 200 and 300 of the crowd were killed. My party fired 1,650 rounds." The Hunter Commission report published the following year by the Government of India criticized both Dyer personally and also the Government of the Punjab for failing to compile a detailed casualty count, and quoted a figure offered by the Sewa Samadhi of 379 identified dead, and approximately 1,200 wounded, of whom 192 were seriously injured. The casualty number estimated by the Indian National Congress was more than 1,500 injured, with approximately 1,000 dead. Although the British did not take any stringent action against Dyer, Churchill, the then Secretary of State for War, and the Army Council decided to allow Dyer to resign with no plan for further punishment. Dyer was lauded for his actions by some in Britain, and indeed became a hero among many of those who were directly benefiting from the British Raj, such as members of the House of Lords. He was, however, widely denounced and criticized in the House of Commons, whose July 1920 Committee of Investigation censured him. Because he was a soldier acting on orders, he could not be tried for murder. The military chose not to bring him before a court-martial, and his only punishment was to be removed from his current appointment, turned down for a proposed promotion, and barred from further employment in India. Dyer subsequently retired from the army and moved to England, where he died, unrepentant about his actions, in 1927. Responses polarized both the British and Indian peoples. Eminent author Rudyard Kipling declared at the time that Dyer did his duty as he saw it. This incident shocked Rabindranath Tagore to such an extent that he renounced his knighthood and stated that such mass murderers aren't worthy of giving any title to anyone. The massacre caused a re-evaluation by the British Army of its military role against civilians to minimal force whenever possible, although later British actions during the Mau Mau insurgencies in Kenya have led historian Hugh Bennett to note that the new policy was not always carried out. The army was retrained and developed less violent tactics for crowd control. The level of casual brutality, and lack of any accountability, stunned the entire nation, resulting in a wrenching loss of faith of the general Indian public in the intentions of the UK. The ineffective inquiry, together with the initial accolades for Dyer, fueled great widespread anger against the British among the Indian populace, leading to the non-cooperation movement of 1920-22. Some historians consider the episode a decisive step towards the end of British rule in India. Britain never formally apologized for the massacre but expressed regret in 2019. The costs of the protracted war in money and manpower were great. High casualty rates in the war, increasing inflation after the end, compounded by heavy taxation, the deadly 1918 flu pandemic, and the disruption of trade during the war escalated human suffering in India. The pre-war Indian nationalist sentiment was revived as moderate and extremist groups of the Indian National Congress ended their differences to unify. In 1916, the Congress was successful in establishing the Lucknow Pact, a temporary alliance with the All India Muslim League. British political concessions and Whitehall's India policy after World War I began to change, with the passage of Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, which initiated the first round of political reform in the Indian subcontinent in 1917. However, this was deemed insufficient in reforms by the Indian political movement. Mahatma Gandhi, recently returned to India, began emerging as an increasingly charismatic leader under whose leadership civil disobedience movements grew rapidly as an expression of political unrest. The recently crushed Ghadar conspiracy, the presence of Mahendra Pratap's Kabul mission in Afghanistan, with possible links to then-nascent Bolshevik Russia, and a still active revolutionary movement especially in Punjab and Bengal, as well as worsening civil unrest throughout India, led to the appointment of a sedition committee in 1918 chaired by Sidney Rowlatt, an English judge. It was tasked to evaluate German and Bolshevik links to the militant movement in India, especially in Punjab and Bengal. On the recommendations of the committee, the Rowlatt Act, an extension of the Defence of India Act 1915, was enforced in India to limit civil liberties. The passage of the Rowlatt Act in 1919 precipitated large-scale political unrest throughout India. Ominously, in 1919, the Third Anglo-Afghan War began in the wake of Amir Habibullah's assassination and institution of Amanullah in a system strongly influenced by the political figures courted by the Kabul mission during the World War. As a reaction to the Rowlatt Act, Muhammad Ali Jinnah resigned from his Bombay seat, writing in a letter to the Viceroy, "I, therefore, as a protest against the passing of the bill and the manner in which it was passed, tender my resignation. A government that passes or sanctions such a law in times of peace forfeits its claim to be called a civilized government." In India, Gandhi's call for protest against the Rowlatt Act achieved an unprecedented response of furious unrest and protests, especially in Punjab. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with disruptions of rail, telegraph, and communication systems. The movement was at its peak before the end of the first week of April, with some recording that practically the whole of Lahore was on the streets. The immense crowd that passed through Anarkali was estimated to be around 20,000. Many officers in the Indian Army believed revolt was possible, and they prepared for the worst. The British Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, Michael O'Dwyer, is said to have believed that these were the early and ill-concealed signs of a conspiracy for a coordinated revolt planned around May, on the lines of the 1857 revolt, at a time when British troops would have withdrawn to the hills for the summer. The Amritsar massacre and other events at about the same time have been described by some historians as the end result of a concerted plan by the Punjab administration to suppress such a conspiracy. James Housemain du Goulet is said to have ascribed a direct relationship between the fear of a Ghadarite uprising in the midst of an increasingly tense situation in Punjab, and the British response that ended in the massacre. On the 10th of April 1919, there was a protest at the residence of Miles Irving, the Deputy Commissioner of Amritsar. The demonstration was to demand the release of two popular leaders of the Indian independence movement, Satia Pal and Saifuddin Kichlu, who had been earlier arrested by the government and moved to a secret location. Both were proponents of the Satyagraha movement led by Gandhi. A military picket shot at the crowd, killing several protesters and setting off a series of violent events. Riotous crowds carried out arson attacks on British banks, killed several British people and assaulted two British females. On the 11th of April, Marcella Sherwood, an elderly English missionary, fearing for the safety of the approximately 600 Indian children under her care, was on her way to shut the schools and send the children home. While traveling through a narrow street called the Kucha Karichan, she was caught by a mob who violently attacked her. She was rescued by some local Indians, including the father of one of her pupils, who hid her from the mob and then smuggled her to the safety of Govindgarh Fort. After visiting Sherwood on the 19th of April, the Rajah's local commander, Colonel Dyer, enraged at the assault, issued an order requiring every Indian man using that street to crawl its length on his hands and knees as a punishment. Colonel Dyer later explained to a British inspector, "Some Indians crawl face downwards in front of their gods. I wanted them to know that a British woman is as sacred as a Hindu god and therefore they have to crawl in front of her, too." He also authorized the indiscriminate, public whipping of locals who came within lathi length of British policemen. Marcellus Sherwood later defended Colonel Dyer, describing him as the savior of the Punjab. For the next 2 days, the city of Amritsar was quiet, but violence continued in other parts of Punjab. Railway lines were cut, telegraph posts destroyed, government buildings burnt, and 3 Europeans murdered. By the 13th of April, the British government had decided to put most of Punjab under martial law. The legislation restricted a number of civil liberties, including freedom of assembly. Gatherings of more than 4 people were banned. On the evening of the 12th of April, the leaders of the Hardal in Amritsar held a meeting at the Hindu college, Dehab Kadikan. At the meeting, Hans Raj, an aide to Kichlu, announced a public protest meeting would be held at 1830 the following day in the Jallianwala Bagh, to be organized by Muhammad Bashir and chaired by a senior and respected Congress party leader, Lal Kanhaiyalal Bhatia. A series of resolutions protesting against the Rowlatt Act, the recent actions of the British authorities and the detention of Satyapal and Kichlu was drawn up and approved, after which the meeting adjourned. At 9 o'clock on the morning of the 13th of April 1919, the traditional festival of Baisakhi. Reginald Dyer, the acting military commander for Amritsar and its environs, proceeded through the city with several city officials, announcing the implementation of a pass system to enter or leave Amritsar, a curfew beginning at 2000 that night and a ban on all processions and public meetings of 4 or more persons. The proclamation was read and explained in English, Urdu, Hindi, and Punjabi, but few paid it any heed or appear to have learned of it later. Meanwhile, local police had received intelligence of the planned meeting in the Jallianwala Bagh through word of mouth and plainclothes detectives in the crowds. At 12:40, Dyer was informed of the meeting and returned to his base at around 13:30 to decide how to handle it. By mid-afternoon, thousands of Indians had gathered in the Jallianwala Bagh garden near the Harmandir Sahib in Amritsar. Many who were present had earlier worshipped at the Golden Temple, and were passing through the Bagh on their way home. The Bagh was, and remains today, an open area of 6 to 7 acres, roughly 200 yards by 200 yards in size, and surrounded on all sides by walls roughly 10 feet in height. Balconies of houses 3 to 4 stories tall overlooked the Bagh, and 5 narrow entrances opened onto it, several with lockable gates. During the rainy season, it was planted with crops, but served as a local meeting and recreation area for much of the year. In the center of the Bagh was a samadhi cremation site, and a large well partly filled with water which measured about 20 feet in diameter. Apart from pilgrims, Amritsar had filled up over the preceding days with farmers, traders, and merchants attending the annual Baisakhi horse and cattle fair. The city police closed the fair at 1400 that afternoon, resulting in a large number of people drifting into the Jallianwala Bagh. Dyer arranged for an aeroplane to overfly the Bagh and estimate the size of the crowd, that he reported was about 6,000, while the Hunter Commission estimates a crowd of 10,000 to 20,000 had assembled by the time of Dyer's arrival. Colonel Dyer and Deputy Commissioner Irving, the senior civil authority for Amritsar, took no actions to prevent the crowd assembling, or to peacefully disperse the crowds. This would later be a serious criticism leveled at both Dyer and Irving. An hour after the meeting began as scheduled at 17:30, Colonel Dyer arrived at the Bagh with a group of 90 soldiers from the Gurkha Rifles, the 54th Sikhs and the 59th Sindh Rifles. 50 of them were armed with .303 Lee Enfield bolt-action rifles. It is not clear whether Dyer had specifically chosen troops from that ethnic group due to their proven loyalty to the British, or that they were simply the Sikh and non-Sikh units most readily available. He had also brought 2 armored cars armed with machine guns. However, the vehicles were left outside, as they were unable to enter the Bagh through the narrow entrances. The Jallianwala Bagh was surrounded on all sides by houses and buildings and had only 5 narrow entrances, most kept permanently locked. The main entrance was relatively wide, but was guarded heavily by the troops backed by the armored vehicles. Dyer, without warning the crowd to disperse, blocked the main exits. He stated later that this act was not to disperse the meeting but to punish the Indians for disobedience. Dyer ordered his troops to begin shooting toward the densest sections of the crowd in front of the available narrow exits, where panicked crowds were trying to leave the bog. Firing continued for approximately 10 minutes. Ceasefire was ordered only when ammunition supplies were almost exhausted, after approximately 1,650 rounds were spent. Apart from the many deaths directly from the shooting, a number of people died of crushing in the stampedes at the narrow gates or by jumping into the solitary well on the compound to escape the shooting. A plaque, placed at the site after independence, states that 120 bodies were removed from the well. The wounded could not be moved from where they had fallen, as a curfew was declared, and more who had been injured then died during the night. The government of Punjab, criticized by the Hunter Commission for not gathering accurate figures, only offered the same approximate figure of 200. When interviewed by the members of the committee, a senior civil servant in Punjab admitted that the actual figure could be higher. The Sewa Samiti Society independently carried out an investigation and reported 379 deaths, and 192 seriously wounded. The Hunter Commission based their figures of 379 deaths, and approximately 3 times this injured on this, suggesting 1,500 casualties. At the meeting of the Imperial Legislative Council held on the 12th of September 1919, the investigation led by Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya concluded that there were 42 boys among the dead, the youngest of them only 7 months old. The Hunter Commission confirmed the deaths of 337 men, 41 boys and a 6-week-old baby. In July 1919, 3 months after the massacre, officials were tasked with finding who had been killed by inviting inhabitants of the city to volunteer information about those who had died. This information was incomplete due to fear that those who participated would be identified as having been present at the meeting, and some of the dead may not have had close relations in the area. Winston Churchill reported nearly 400 slaughtered, and 3 or 4 times the number wounded to the Westminster Parliament, on the 8th of July 1920. Since the official figures were obviously flawed regarding the size of the crowd, the number of rounds fired and the period of shooting, the Indian National Congress instituted a separate inquiry of its own, with conclusions that differed considerably from the British government's inquiry. The casualty number quoted by the Congress was more than 1,500, with approximately 1,000 being killed. Indian nationalist Swami Shraddhanand wrote to Gandhi of 1,500 deaths in the incident. The British government tried to suppress information of the massacre, but news spread in India and widespread outrage ensued. Details of the massacre did not become known in Britain until December 1919.
Thank you for watching and listening. Please subscribe this channel for more Indian knowledge.